Okay, so this is the Bond Elite knitting machine. So the Bond Elite is different than the regular Bonds. They're not interchangeable. It's a completely different beast. The Bond Elite is more like the LK150, which is probably more well known, but needless to say the Bond Elite came before the LK150. But anyway, it's the same sort of setup. The original Bonds, like the blue original Bond, the Bond Classic, the Bond Incredible Sweater Machine, Bond Ultimate Sweater Machine, all those ones are an 8mm gauge, and they just had a series of plastic needle retaining bars, and they just snapped in just to hold the needles in place. They didn't add any pressure to the needles, so the needles just moved about freely, and that's how those machines were designed to work. But the Bond Elite was much of an improvement, and they added a needle retaining sponge, so the needles were more firmly held in place. There was a ribber made for this machine that worked very well. It had a yarn take-up spring, so you didn't have to pull the slack back at the beginning of a row. It was much of an improvement. So if you have a Bond Elite, you'll need to change the sponge in the underside of the bed where the needles are, because it will not knit properly if you don't change it, because by this time, 30 years on, they'll be no good. They'll need replacing. The sponge will have deteriorated. So if you take the black metal backing off, there's 20 screws that hold it in place. They're very easy to see where they are. You take that backing off. Probably before you take the back off, you'll want to remove all the needles. You'll just, much like the LK150, you'll bring the needles forward to holding position, close the latch and pull back and up to remove them from the machine. So you take all the needles out, take off this black plate off the back, which is actually stood over there, the metal back plate, and it will reveal a sponge which is probably completely deteriorated and left a right sticky horrible mess, which you'll have to clean. And I've already cleaned this. I've took everything out so it's just the plastic, no metal, and I've washed it in warm soapy water and cleaned it all. So now it's time to put the sponge in. Now a sponge for one of these machines, an LK150 sponge will be too thick really for the Bond Elite, so my advice is to find one on Amazon. I'll probably let you know which item number this was. If you just type in needle retaining sponge, it'll come up. It'll probably be one of the first ones. But for this sort of machine, you'll need about a 1 centimetre thick, so that's how thick the sponge is this way. I'm not sure if it's square actually, so it might be 1 centimetre all the way around, so it will fit nicely in that channel there. So for the Bond Elite, you're going to want a sponge that is, it's hard to get this in focus, sorry about this. That's a bit better. The sponge is just exposed on one side. There's no adhesive on it. You do not want adhesive on the back of this. And if you get one that does have an adhesive backing on, don't take it off, just leave it on. You don't want one side to be sticky at all, because this isn't actually a needle retaining bar, as most people call it, or a sponge bar. It's actually called a break sponge. A needle retaining bar or sponge bar is what a metal bed machine has, like a Japanese machine, Knitmaster, Brother, Silvery, Toyota, etc., where they have a physical metal bar and the sponge is glued onto this bar, and then you slide the entire bar into the machine. Well, this setup is actually called a break sponge, so that's what these are actually called, or a needle retaining sponge strip. So, as I said, one side is just exposed sponge, there's no adhesive on it or anything, and the other side has like a felt or vinyl backing on it, and it has to have the backing on. If you buy one of those kits that has an iron-on one that you have to cut flush with the sponge, then that's fine also, but you need to make sure the backing is on there, because the needles will ride against this, and if there's no protection for that sponge, it will wear out very quickly. So with the sponge side facing down and the felt or vinyl side facing up, get rid of that piece of fluff or whatever that is. There we go. The sponge side down, the felt or vinyl side facing up, you want to put it into the needle channel. You want to extend it past the end, maybe about 1.5 inches, 2 inches, something like that. And you just want to gently press the sponge into place like this. It can be a bit tricky to do at first. It gets easier as you go along, honestly. There we go. You just press it in like this all the way along. You're just pushing it into that gully. Don't stretch it as you're doing it, just let it be pushed in naturally. You do that all the way along till the end. When you get to the end, pull it up a little bit and trim off any excess that you have. Okay? Push that down into place. So what you'll have is you'll have a little bit on each end, about 2 inches or so. This sponge will be completely flush in this gully now, all the way along. Like that. So now it's time to put the needles back in. I've put 3 in already so you can see what the reason for this sponge strip is in the first place. You can see when I push them like that, recklessly, they don't just have a mind of their own, they stay pretty well without moving too much because they're under tension, which is what we want. So you can see this more clearly if I turn the bed over. You can see where the sponge is just comfortably sat there and where the needles are on top of the sponge. You can see as the sponge is trying to push back to go to its natural resting position, it's pushing back against these needles and adding pressure to them, which you can see here where the difference where the sponge is just sat there and it's been pressed down here. So that's the reason for the sponge retaining strip, is to add tension onto the needles that sit on top of it. So I'm going to show you how to put these needles in now. Now the sponge does fit nice and snugly, if you get the correct one, of course. It fits nicely and snugly into the needle channel and it doesn't just drop out, so you'll be able to move the bed back and forth like this without it dropping out. And you will need to be moving it like that as you're inserting these needles, because it's a two-handed job and you've got to be pushing the needles in with one hand on the top side of the bed and reaching underneath and pressing on the needles to let them ride home. So I clean my needles in Surgical Spirit. That's just what I use here in the UK. Most machine knitters over here use Surgical Spirit. If you're from another country and this word is alien to you, I'd recommend asking a machine knitter from your country what they use to clean their needles, and that might be more helpful. But whether you clean them or not, it's entirely up to you. So we're going to insert needles one at a time. We want to make sure that every time we insert a new one that the latch is open. We slide the needle into the needle channel at quite a steep angle, so it goes under the sponge. When you're putting the first one in, you might have to fight with it a little bit to get it under that sponge. You turn the bed over and you'd be holding this needle butt straight here with one hand, and you'd reach under from underneath with the other hand and press on that needle. See if you can see this. There's little slots here where the needles slide through, and you would use one hand to make sure that that needle stayed straight. There we go, sort of. I'll use the carpet to help me here, I think. There we go. And you would, no, there we are. And we press on it, there we go, and push it home. There we go. Oh, isn't the floor is a wonderful tool sometimes when you're trying to use one hand. So basically, once you've got that into that slot there, this is the slot basically, this slot. that we want to press the needle into the sponge so it lines up with that slot, and then we can push those needles home like that. And we do the same all the way along. I start randomly, you can start at the end if you want, but I usually start somewhere random and work outwards from there. There we go, under the sponge. Turn the bed over. Again, I'm going to use the carpet to assist me here. There we are. Press down on the needle so it lines up with that slot and slide it home. And there we are. And we just repeat that process all the way along so all these needles are underneath the sponge. So now all the needles are back in, and you can see this is what we have all the way along. You can see that the needles are on top of the sponge is underneath, and the sponge is adding, you can see this, get my fingers out of the way, it's adding pressure onto those needles. So now if we turn the bed over, make sure all these needles are back in non-working position, and we tip the bed forward completely upright, you can see the needles stay where they are, and even if I shake it a bit, you can see they still stay where they are. Just the same, if I was to bring them all out to holding position, all these needles are out now in holding position. And if I tip the bed completely upright, they stay where they are, and even if I jiggle the bed about while it's upright, you'll see that they don't move. They're all completely where they should be, and that's what we want. So I must stress that if you get a Bond-Elite or an LK150 that's old, or even one of those brother convertibles, or KX350 I think they're called, they look like an LK150 but they're made by brother. A Bond-Elite, anything like that, those plastic bed machines, they will need a new sponge strip if they're old, because they will not knit properly if you don't change it. Certainly in the case with the Bond-Elite, and it's probably the same with other machines, but certainly it would be more so with the Bond-Elite, because the bonds knit with weight constantly. So when you hang the weighted hem onto the elastic and start knitting, it's pulling down on these needles here, which will cause these needle butts to lift up because there's nothing here pressing them down. So the needle butts will lift up, and as you try and move the carriage, it will constantly jam, and that will also damage the needle channels. It will gouge them if you jam the carriage quite rough. So yeah, I must stress, if you get a Bond-Elite or an LK150 or brother equivalent machine, or an LK100, anything like that, if it's old, it'll need a new sponge retaining strip or brake sponge. So there we go, that's how we replace the needle retaining sponge strip in a Bond-Elite.